Okay, so let's take a look at this thing called intuition. Laws are only reached by non-logical methods. To make a law, one has to have an intellectual love of the subject. That's Einstein. Okay, so let's take a look at this idea of intuition as a way of knowing. So one could define intuition as an emotion that's defined as a particular feeling that we have as a source of information. Now, intuition is a little bit different than, say, love or hate, because it's usually seen as kind of like this sort of just sort of general feeling you have rather than a specific emotion. Sometimes you associate it with that sort of aha moment where you discover something through a process of reasoning. Archimedes actually came up with a very famous sort of principle behind this. It was said that when he was lying in the bath, he came up with his very famous principle and jumped out of the bath and ran down the street yelling "Eureka" when he encountered it. Okay, that moment where you solve the problem out of nowhere, right, could be a way you describe intuition or insight, right? Now, there's more to intuition than just that. But sometimes when you're not able to solve a problem, the answer might come to you suddenly and mysteriously, almost like knowledge just appears in your brain, okay? Some might even extend this to things like a sixth sense or a hunch as intuition, as these flashes of creative power that knowledge just gets blown into your brain all of a sudden magically. Okay, so for example, you might have this intuition that someone is standing behind you. And then you turn around, and sure enough, someone's standing behind you. How did you know that? Well, maybe it was through intuition that you knew that. So intuitions sometimes, though, aren't very reliable, okay? Sometimes when you turn around, nobody's there. So is intuition an actual thing, or is it just chance? So that's what we're going to sort of debate today. But let's start by talking about three different types of intuition. The core intuitions are fundamental intuitions about life, the universe, and everything. Subject-specific intuitions that relate to specific areas of knowledge like science and ethics. And social intuitions about other people, what they're like, whether they can be trusted or not, etc. So we'll distinguish these three different types of intuition. All emotions were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. That was a description of Sherlock Holmes. Okay, so let's take a look at core intuitions. So it could be argued philosophically that all of our knowledge is based on intuition. That reason and perception, which are said to give us knowledge, ultimately rely on intuition. We've already looked at reason and emotion and perception and language, and we've dissected some of the faults of those ways of knowing. So for example, in reason, if we look at the laws of logic as a starting point of reasoning, we can't really prove logic in terms of fundamental laws. You can't prove logic with logic, so to speak. So when people are asked to justify the laws of logic, most people would make an appeal to intuition by saying, well, we know that 2 equals 2 because it's just true. It's just intuitively true. So that might be an argument to say that intuition is the background of reason. Similarly, in perception, we can't always be sure about what we think our senses are detecting. Can we be sure that we're not dreaming right now? Can we be sure that we're not a brain in a vat or plugged into the matrix? We have no way to be ultimately sure of this. So ultimately, again, we might make an appeal to intuition to say, well, I just know intuitively that I'm not plugged into the matrix right now. I actually am experiencing what I think I'm experiencing. So a good way to sort of look at these knowledge claims is to play the why game, right? So if someone tells you a claim, like I know X, right? And then you ask them, well, why do you believe that? And then they answer. Then you say, well, why do you believe that? And why? So very much like, say, a 2-year-old child. Why? Ultimately, if they don't punch you, someone will eventually say, you know what? It's just true. Stop asking why. It's just obvious. right? If you ask someone, well, why is the sky blue? And they say, well, there's this atmosphere and the way light refracts off it when it comes through. Well, why? Well, there's molecules and there's, gluons and neurons and protons. And, well, why is there that? Well, there's these strings vibrating in the fourth dimension. And, well, why is there that? Okay, shut up. It's just true, okay? Ultimately, you get to that point where you often have to rely on intuition as the ender of the argument. It could be the final sort of nail in the coffin that says, this is why. And that kind of leads to where intuition could be put as a source of knowledge. So here's some big philosophical questions, right? Do I exist? Is life a dream, right? If something is a banana, how can it be not a banana at the same time, right? Parallel lines never meet, etc. There's a bunch of, say, philosophical points there. If someone was to ask you for each of those different points, why do you believe the following statements? Ultimately, you might have to go to intuition, right? If I asked you, why does 1 + 1 = 2, you might be able to give an explanation, and then I ask the why question to that, then you might take it to the next level and answer it, but ultimately you might have to go to an intuitive answer and use intuition as your kind of ender for that discussion. So in that sense, as a core, intuition kind of stands as the beginning point of knowledge claims in this argument. Okay, there's actually a school of philosophical thought called Romanticism that's associated with emotion this way, okay? Many people in this romantic movement or the Romanticism philosophy would basically emphasize that emotional intuition was a way to make sense of the world, okay? Since a lot of our fundamental beliefs ultimately could be based on intuition, it could then be said that the Romanticists had a philosophy that had some backing. It seemed like in a lot of ways that Romanticism was just that. It was this sort of pie in the sky, sort of life is about emotions type philosophy. But if we accept the premise that intuition as an emotional state is the basis of all knowledge, then maybe they had something there, okay? The criticism, though, of this is that intuition is not a basis of knowledge because we all have different intuitions. So how could it be a standard base for knowledge if we all have different intuitions? If we all had different intuitions, we'd all have different knowledge sets. Yet we seem to have a lot of common, core, shared knowledge. So it'd be nice to believe that everyone could agree upon what's intuitively obvious, but that's easy to disprove. Issues like the origins of the universe, abortion, can a computer think? Can a mind exist outside the body? Many people have strong intuitive answers to those hard questions that are clearly not the same as somebody else. There's an easy way you can find out that people have very different core intuitions when you ask tough questions like that, okay? So here's 3 questions to cast doubt on the claim that intuition is a source of knowledge. 1, if something is intuitively obvious, must everyone agree with it? Is there anything that everyone can agree with, for example? 2, could you be wrong in thinking that something is intuitively obvious? Might you one day come to think that what you thought was intuitive was in fact incorrect, or maybe a prejudice, it was the wrong answer? And thirdly, whose intuition should you trust? Do you trust some people's intuitions more than others? And that's where I'm going to lead the discussion in a second there. The opinions that are held with passion are always those for which no good ground exists. Indeed, the passion is the measure of the holder's lack of rational conviction. Okay, so let's now turn to specific intuitions within subject areas. Okay, so if we make this appeal to intuition to claim knowledge, okay, we got to be careful about that. But there is this amount of evidence to say that people with an uneducated intuition are not as perhaps intuitively correct as those that are, Okay? In other words, if you actually educate yourself in subject areas, you might actually educate your intuition. Okay? So sometimes if you are ignorant of these things, your intuition could be very, very wrong. Okay? So let's try a test here. Linda's 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, bright, very much involved in social issues like disarmament and equal rights. Which of the following statements do you think is more likely? Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. Which, if you had to pick one, which do you think would intuitively lead you out of the two statements? The first or the second? Which do you think? Which one? The second? Okay. Now, why are you being led that way intuitively? Right. It's because of the information, right? By being given more information, it's shaping your intuition maybe one way over the other. And maybe that's the way we could look at education, is it's a way to help narrow our choices and better educate our intuition, right? Well, either one could be intuitively correct, but maybe our education helps us drive one way or the other. It's more probable that she's a bank teller. That's the actual answer. Out of the probability factor, if we were to do this mathematically, it's actually more likely that she's just a bank teller, because this one adds information. So in both cases, she's a bank teller. But to then add on that she's also in the feminist movement, that's less likely. But why did we choose that? Because our education intuitively kind of drove us that way. So maybe our intuitions in that case were actually incorrect, because it's actually more probable that she's just a bank teller. Okay, let's try another one. I toss a coin 6 times in a row up in the air, and it lands. Which of the following sequences of coin tosses is more likely? Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, or heads, 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 heads? Which do you think is more likely? The first one? Okay. So now your intuition seems to be driving you towards the first one. Okay. The probability is that in this case, if we did the probability calculations, it's 1 out of 2 chances times 6, which is 1 over 64. So the answer is neither. They are both equally likely. They both have the same probability. Okay? So in that case, I was kind of tricking you. The answer is neither. Neither one is more likely. The answer is they are both the same. They have the same probability of occurring. Let's try a third one. Let's take a soccer match, which has 11 players on each side and a referee. Okay, so there's 23 people on the field, right? 11 players, and a referee. What are the odds of 2 people on the field having the same birthday? What would you guess? Well, if we do this mathematically, and again, this might be a math type question, a probability question, we can take 2 people and say there are 364 days that one person can have a different birthday from the other 2. So it's 364 divided by 365. We add people, we multiply. With 23 people, it works out to 0.492. So the probability of 2 people having the same birthday is 0.508%. Okay? It's pretty small. Okay? It's a pretty small probability. Now, I wasn't expecting you to do that mentally, but I'm just wondering if that number, 0.5, was even close to the number you imagined it would be. Was your intuition correct there? Now, the question is, how correct would it be for you guys maybe? Maybe you were, in fact, very close to that number. But you have an education in math probabilities, a lot of you do. Depending on the amount of math you've taken, you've probably done probability calculations like this before. If I present this to, say, a student who has not done probability calculations, maybe someone who didn't take, say, a pre-cal or applied math, or maybe has been struggling with math over their whole high school career, really struggling with math and hasn't done probability calculations, would they have the same probability there? Would their intuition work the same as yours? That's the posed question, is can you educate your intuition? Okay, so you're standing on a flat plain. So in other words, we're here in the prairies, right? So you're standing in a parking lot, holding a bullet in your left hand and a loaded gun in your right hand. If you fire the gun and drop the bullet, which hits the ground first? So you said the one you were holding hits the ground first? And Lauren, you say the same time, right? They both hit at the same time?
Wait, you shoot
Yeah, you shoot a gun and you drop a bullet. So right here at the same time, you pull the trigger and drop the bullet. So the bullet's going to shoot out. Now imagine this is a really long parking lot, right? So eventually that bullet's going to hit the ground. And the bullet you dropped obviously is going to hit the ground. Which hits first? Same time, and the one that you dropped. They do reach at the same time. Okay? The bullets will both hit at the exact same time, will hit the ground. Okay? Now, Lauren, have you taken physics?
Yeah.
Ah. Alex, have you taken physics? Yeah? So your intuition might easily sway you to say the one you drop, but it's not true. I remember that one of the first times I was in middle school, a teacher posed that question to me. They said, I take a bag of feathers and a bag of bricks and I drop them off a building. Which hits the ground first, right? And the answer is they hit at the same time, right? Because gravity has that sort of rate of fall. It's the same, right? But our intuition doesn't necessarily lead us that way. But if we educate ourselves, in a way, it educates our intuitions. So sometimes intuition is bad, right? Intuition isn't going to give you the right answer, okay? So a lot of psychologists will argue that we shouldn't just blindly follow our intuition, that we need to kind of critically analyze our intuitions as well. Some might argue that the whole goal of education is to unlearn intuitions so that we can repackage them into a more sophisticated model of analyzing knowledge than just relying on intuition. So let's take a look at 3 areas to try and demonstrate this. In physics, okay, objects will move only to the extent that they've been given a momentum or an impetus or an oomph. And that if no force is applied, it will grind to a halt. This seems to reflect our world experience, right? There was a belief for centuries that Newton's first law of motion proposed an object in motion stays in motion and an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by a force. You've probably all seen that in physics class. And you might have learned this and believed it, and it would seem counterintuitive to what might be obvious in the real world, okay? In many concepts of physics, like for example quantum mechanics, the concepts are so counterintuitive that even physicists have trouble making sense of them. If you don't believe that, I'd encourage you to look up something called the double slit experiment in quantum physics. It's extremely counterintuitive. It's not at all what you'd think should happen. And we'll turn to another example in biology. 200 years ago, everyone thought it was intuitively obvious that everything in nature had a purpose, and that since each species had its own unique essence, one species could not evolve into another, okay? Charles Darwin then was sort of brought into to say that, well, nature actually has this mechanism called evolution where species can change from one into another. In ethics, again with intuition, we have a lot of problems sometimes trusting moral intuitions. Because at different times in history, people have thought things were intuitively right that now we think are intuitively wrong. So for examples, for centuries, it was just intuitively obvious that men were superior to women. That was the position that was taken ethically. And that it was also intuitively obvious that some people were naturally slaves. But I doubt that very few people in today's world would accept those ethics as intuitively obvious. Okay? Now, a little bit controversial on some of this stuff, for sure, but nonetheless, it's that change in intuition from what was believed to be intuitively obvious then versus now in 3 areas that seem to be changing. Man is a rational animal who loses his temper when called upon to act in accordance with the dictates of reason. Okay, so now let's turn to social intuitions. So as social animals, okay, we tend to be a little overconfident in our intuitions, okay? So we tend to put a lot of trust in intuition about other people, like our judge of character of other people. Evidence shows that our intuitions are not very reliable, right? For example, if you do a simple study, is this person lying to me? Yes or no? We actually are not very good at detecting that, okay? Countless experiments, even people who claim to be experts at telling you whether or not someone's lying, they really don't do that well in these tests. It's kind of basically at the level of chance. People are not good at telling whether or not somebody's lying or not. Now that might also speak to the fact that we're good at lying, but we tend to rely on our intuition to say, well, I got a feeling that he's lying, when he might not be, or vice versa. So in social interactions, our intuitions are notoriously bad at judging characters, okay? Yet we rely on them all the time. We constantly say, well, I got a gut feeling about that person. Okay, so let's sort of take another look at this idea between educated intuition and natural intuition, okay? So natural intuitions, very unreliable. Educated intuitions, that's a different example. So let's think of someone who's a grandmaster at chess. And he takes a look at a chessboard and he thinks about it. And he thinks, you know what, this is the best move. My intuition says this is the best move to make. Now, that intuition of the chess grandmaster is not just some gut feeling. It's some gut feeling based on a wealth of experience in the game of chess. Tons of experience, tons of talent, tons of practice. That intuition is not just some random thought that came out of his brain. It's come from a long sort of line of education in the realm of chess. Think about, again, experts in biology, experts in medicine, experts in baseball. Many of the so-called breakthroughs in history have come from these so-called flashes of intuition, but these flashes of intuition might be coming from a long series of education that got to that point. So, for example, there was a French mathematician who concluded that mathematical creativity is not a matter of just following the rules, but also having the insight to see which combinations are worth exploring, okay? How he could come up with that sort of statement is through the education he received in the realm of mathematics, okay? So when we look back at those moments of intuition when all of a sudden some knowledge just seemed to come to us out of nowhere, okay? Is it that that's the shortcut? We could just always rely on that to happen. Oh, I don't know the answer to this math problem during the test. I'll just wait for intuition to just pop it into my head. Well, no. Some might say that this could actually be a kind of laziness if we rely on that. That intuition might actually be the result of education, okay? So, does it have a role? Sure it does. But it's, again, a very open-ended kind of an idea of what intuition actually is. I might say in order to have a good intuition, you should have a thorough understanding of the subject, okay? No person who's spent their whole life not thinking about physics is going to all of a sudden solve a major physics problem out of the blue. That's very unlikely. And then the second thing would be that you actually are thinking about that thing. That you can't just be walking down the street thinking about cheesecake and all of a sudden physics pops into your brain, that you kind of had to be at least thinking about it to start. The axioms in philosophy are not axioms until they are proven on our pulses. So how reliable is it? How reliable is your intuition? Sure, educated intuition more reliable than natural intuition? Okay? But should we trust it, even when we're educated? Should we put a test to intuition? Does tests of intuition coincide with other ways of knowing, like reason and language, etc.? Okay? If it does, if intuition does seem to lead to knowledge, what should we do in terms of trusting it? When we make decisions in the real world, reason and intuition might actually conflict with each other. And in the end, a lot of people go with intuition. I mean, think about that. Sometimes you have to make that choice, and sometimes, very often, you say, well, I'm just going to go with my gut. I'm going to go with my intuition here. It is very often the big decision maker. So this is where I see intuition falling in our ways of knowing. I do still feel it's kind of part of our emotion. I've separated it now as a separate way of knowing. As I've said to you before, it was previously part of my discussion about emotion, and I think it could still be put there. So can this idea of intuition and emotion lead to knowledge? It's a really open-ended area. It's why I wanted to start with intuition with you guys, because to me, it connects directly to the other ways of knowing that we'd already talked about: reason, perception, language, emotion. Okay? I think this is a good point to bring up, that when we talk about ways of knowing, it's not one of these things standing alone. That we kind of mush all these together when we make a claim. I know that my sister's name is Sue. I know that the sky is blue. It is a mix of all the ways of knowing, including possibly intuition, which could be splitting off of emotion. Okay? And as we see, we're going to look at memory. What does it sort of relate to? We're going to look at faith. We're going to look at imagination. How do those fit into this model? Okay, the traditional four ways, philosophically, reason, perception, language, and emotion, to me are the core ways of knowing. These four new ones that the IB has kind of thrown into the curriculum, I like them as a point of discussion, but I do see them as kind of subsets of ones we've already looked at. Okay, so let's put your intuitions to the test with another activity right now. Just one sec here.